The steam rising from Bjorn Ironside's open chest wound looked like smoke in the -20 air. Blood poured down his naked torso as he stood waist-deep in a Norwegian fjord at midnight, his skin blue-white under the winter moon. The wound went 3 inches deep from an Saxon axe that had split his ribs, but he wasn't shivering. Around him, 12 other warriors stood equally naked and bleeding in the freezing water, their breath forming clouds that froze before hitting the surface. They had been standing there for 2 hours. In 6 more hours, when the sun rose, they would march 20 miles through snow to attack another village. None of them would die from cold or blood loss. These were Viking berserkers performing a ritual that modern doctors say should have killed them in minutes. Bjorn Ironside was the son of Ragnar Lodbrok, and this was December 867 AD in the fjords of western Norway. His men had just finished burning a monastery near Trondheim and were preparing for their next raid. But first, they needed to prove they were stronger than death itself. The answer lies in techniques so brutal and precise that they were passed down through generations like military secrets. What these men knew about surviving cold while wounded would revolutionize modern medicine if we understood it completely. Each warrior would strip completely naked and use a sharp knife to cut a wound somewhere on their chest or arms. Not deep enough to hit major artery, but deep enough to bleed heavily. Then they walked into water that was cold enough to freeze skin in minutes. The combination of blood loss and extreme cold should have sent them into shock immediately. Instead, they used a breathing technique that actually made their bodies generate more heat. Each warrior would take 7 deep breaths in through their nose, holding each breath for a count of 4 heartbeats. Then they would exhale through their mouth in one explosive burst. This pattern flooded their blood with oxygen while forcing their heart rate to slow down instead of speed up. Modern scientists call this controlled hypothermic breathing, and it can raise core body temperature by 3 degrees even in freezing water. The mixing of blood created a seal that helped stop bleeding while their shared body heat kept the wound area from freezing. This technique, called blood bonding, was documented by Saxon chroniclers who thought it was some kind of dark magic. They were half right. The real magic happened in their muscles. As the cold hit their skin, Vikings would begin a series of micro-movements that were invisible to anyone watching. They would tense and release specific muscle groups in a pattern that created internal heat without shivering. Shivering was forbidden because it wasted energy and showed weakness. Instead, they learned to generate heat through controlled muscle contractions that kept blood flowing to their vital organs. After exactly 2 hours in the water, they would climb out and immediately smear this mixture over their entire body, paying special attention to their wounds. Bear fat doesn't freeze until temperatures hit -40 degrees, and pine resin has natural antiseptic properties. This combination created a waterproof barrier that locked in body heat while preventing infection. This sounds insane, but the snow actually acted as insulation over the fat layer. The movement created friction heat, while the snow formed a protective layer that trapped warm air against their skin. Vikings called this wolf rolling because they learned it by watching wolves survive in extreme cold. They were holes dug 3 feet deep into the ground and covered with pine branches and animal hides. These underground shelters stayed 20 degrees warmer than the surface temperature because of heat from the earth below. 6 warriors would pile into each shelter, using shared body heat to warm up slowly over the next 4 hours. They would lie in a pattern called the wolf pack, with heads pointing toward the center and bodies radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. This position allowed everyone to breathe freely while maximizing heat transfer between bodies. During the warming process, each warrior had to stay awake for the entire 4 hours. Falling asleep in this state meant death from hypothermic shock. To stay conscious, they would recite their family lineage back 20 generations, tell stories of previous raids, or sing songs about their gods. The constant talking served 2 purposes. It kept them mentally alert, and the vibrations from their voices helped warm their chest cavities. Their blood pressure would spike as circulation returned to normal, and many warriors would vomit or pass out from the sudden change. This is when most deaths occurred, not from the cold itself, but from the body's reaction to getting warm again. Experienced warriors knew to drink small sips of heated mead mixed with seal oil during the warming process. The alcohol helped their blood vessels adjust gradually, while the seal oil provided concentrated calories their bodies desperately needed. By dawn, these same warriors who had been naked and bleeding in freezing water would be ready for a 20-mile march through snow. Their wounds would be scabbed over, and their bodies would be generating heat more efficiently than before. Vikings believed this ritual made them temporarily immune to cold for up to 3 days afterward. Modern research suggests they might have been right. By regularly exposing themselves to extreme cold while controlling their body's response, Vikings actually changed how their metabolism worked. Their blood would carry more red blood cells, their muscles would store more glycogen for emergency energy, and their blood vessels would become more efficient at moving heat around their bodies. Warriors who could survive this ritual felt invincible when facing normal battlefield conditions. Wearing armor and fighting in regular winter weather felt easy after spending hours naked in a frozen fjord. This mental toughness was often the difference between victory and defeat in Viking raids. The ritual also served as a brutal selection process. Not every man who attempted it survived. Those who died were considered weak by Viking standards and were not given warrior burial. Those who survived became part of an elite group within the berserker class. These men were the ones chosen for the most dangerous raids. The ones sent ahead as scouts in enemy territory, and the ones who led charges against fortified positions. They would stand naked in frozen streams while practicing sword movements, combining weapon training with cold adaptation. Their version included binding their breasts with strips of walrus hide that had been soaked in whale oil. This binding technique kept blood flowing to their chest muscles while protecting them from frostbite in sensitive areas. These warriors would live alone in the wilderness for entire winters, wearing only animal skins and surviving by hunting and raiding. They would sleep in snow caves and eat raw meat to avoid creating fires that might give away their position. Some ice wolves would go months without seeing another human being, emerging in spring as barely recognizable wild men who had to be slowly reintegrated into society. The knowledge of these survival techniques was considered so valuable that it was passed down only from father to son, and only to sons who had proven themselves worthy through years of training. The training began when boys turned 12 years old. They would start with cold baths in gradually lower temperatures, learning the breathing techniques and muscle control methods over a period of several years. By 18, he could control his heart rate and body temperature well enough to survive the full ritual. Only about 1 in 10 boys who began this training would successfully complete it. The rest would either quit during the process or die during their final test. The final test was always conducted during the winter solstice, when temperatures were at their lowest and nights were longest. The candidate would be taken to a remote fjord, stripped naked, given a shallow wound, and forced to survive alone for 3 days and nights, using only the techniques he had learned. No shelter, no fire, no help from other warriors. If he lived, he was accepted as a berserker. If he died, his body was left for the wolves as an offering to Odin. Navy SEALs use controlled breathing methods similar to wolf breathing during cold water survival training. The US military has researched the fat and resin mixture Vikings used and developed synthetic versions for extreme weather operations. But no modern military unit has attempted to recreate the full Viking ritual because medical officers consider it too dangerous. The closest modern equivalent to Viking cold survival training happens in Russian special forces units, where soldiers are required to break through ice and swim in frozen rivers. But even these extreme exercises are conducted with medical supervision and emergency warming equipment standing by. Vikings had none of these safety, just their knowledge and their willingness to risk death for the chance to become living weapons. The warrior culture that produced these survival techniques died out gradually as Christianity spread through Scandinavia, and warfare became more organized around professional armies rather than individual raiders. The last recorded instance of the naked fjord ritual was in 1012 AD, when Olaf Haraldsson used it to train his personal guard before attacking English settlement. By 1100 AD, the knowledge had been largely forgotten as Viking society transitioned away from raiding toward farming and trade. But traces of these techniques survived in isolated communities throughout Norway and Iceland for centuries. Fishing families would use modified versions of Viking breathing methods to survive when their boats were caught in winter storms. Hunters would use the fat and resin mixture to prevent frostbite during long tracking expeditions. Some of these folk remedies were still being used as late as the 1800s by people who had no idea they were practicing ancient berserker survival methods. The psychological impact of mastering these techniques went far beyond simple survival skill. Vikings who could control their body's response to extreme cold believed they had achieved a kind of spiritual connection with their gods. They saw their ability to survive conditions that killed other men as proof that they were chosen by Odin for special purposes. This religious conviction made them even more dangerous in battle because they fought without fear of death. The combination of physical conditioning, mental training, and spiritual belief created warriors who were genuinely different from other medieval fighters. Their ability to function in conditions that would incapacitate normal soldiers gave them massive advantages during winter raids. They could attack when enemies expected them to be huddled around fires, travel through terrain that other armies considered impassable, and fight effectively in weather that made conventional weapons difficult to use. When Bjorn Ironside emerged from that fjord in 867 AD, steam still rising from his wound in the freezing air, He had completed a transformation that was part physical training, part religious ritual, and part genetic selection process. He and his men represented the end result of generations of Vikings who had used extreme survival techniques to create superhuman warriors. They were the products of a culture that valued death-defying courage above all else, and had developed precise methods for turning ordinary men into living weapons capable of surviving anything nature could throw at them. These were professionals who had turned surviving the impossible into a repeatable, teachable skill that could mean the difference between conquest and failure when winter campaigns demanded everything a warrior could give. The most documented case of these techniques saving lives happened during the siege of Paris in 885 AD. Viking raiders led by Rollo had been attacking the city for months when an early winter trapped them on the wrong side of the Seine River. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and the Vikings found themselves cut off from their ships with no supplies, and Saxon armies closing in from 3 directions. Any normal army would have surrendered or died. Instead, Rollo ordered his men to perform the naked fjord ritual using the frozen Seine itself. French chroniclers watched in horror as 300 Viking warriors stripped naked, cut themselves with knives, and walked into water so cold it had chunks of ice floating in it. The French assumed they were watching a mass suicide ritual. They were wrong. Then they did something that terrified the watching French soldiers more than any battle cry. They rolled naked in the snow for 10 minutes, stood up, and began laughing. Not the desperate laughter of men losing their minds, but the confident laughter of warriors who knew they had just become invincible. That night, while French soldiers huddled around fires and Saxon armies camped in heated tents, the Vikings marched 15 miles through a blizzard and attacked a supply convoy that no one expected them to reach. They moved through snow that came up to their waists in darkness, with wounds still bleeding from their ritual. They captured enough supplies to last the winter and disappeared back into the storm before anyone could organize a counterattack. The French chronicler who recorded this event wrote that the Vikings seemed to draw strength from cold and pain rather than being weakened by it. He was describing something that modern scientists are only beginning to understand about how extreme conditioning can actually rewire the human nervous system. This wasn't just the naked fjord ritual, but a year-round conditioning program that started in childhood and continued throughout a warrior's life. Boys who showed promise as fighters would be subjected to progressively more extreme temperature challenges, designed to change how their bodies and minds responded to cold. Starting at age 7, boys would be woken before dawn and forced to break through the ice on streams or ponds to bathe in water that was just above freezing. These baths lasted exactly 3 minutes, and were timed using a method Vikings learned from watching how long it took ice to form on their breath in different temperatures. They would dig shallow depressions in snow, line them with pine boughs, and spend the entire night exposed to temperatures that regularly dropped below zero. The boys who survived these weekly ordeals without frostbite or illness would advance to the next level of training. The next phase involved what modern doctors would recognize as controlled pain conditioning, combined with cold exposure. 12-year-old boys would be given shallow cuts on their arms and legs, then forced to sit naked in snow until the bleeding stopped naturally. This taught them to ignore pain while their bodies were under extreme stress, and it conditioned their blood to clot faster in cold conditions. Viking boys learned to associate cold and pain with strength rather than suffering. They were taught that every time they survived something that should have killed them, they were stealing power from their enemies. This mental framework turned what should have been torture into a source of pride and confidence. They were taken to isolated locations during the worst storms of winter and forced to survive for 7 days with no shelter, no fire, and no food except what they could catch or scavenge. The only tools they were allowed were a knife and a small amount of the bear fat and pine resin mixture. Everything else had to come from their training and their will to survive. The ones who survived emerged as something fundamentally different from ordinary humans. They had proven they could function when normal biological responses should have shut their bodies down. They were required to kill a wolf with their bare hands while naked in winter conditions. This wasn't metaphorical. They literally had to track down a wild wolf, fight it without weapons or clothing, and strangle it. The wolf's blood was then mixed with their own and used to create tattoos that marked them as members of the Berserker Brotherhood. First, their bodies learned to produce much higher levels of norepinephrine, a hormone that constricts blood vessels in the extremities while increasing blood flow to vital organs. Second, their muscle fibers adapted to burn fat more efficiently, creating internal heat without the energy waste of shivering. Instead of their brains interpreting extreme cold as a threat that required panic responses, Vikings learned to recognize cold as a signal that they were entering a state of enhanced performance. Their heart rates would actually slow down in freezing conditions while their mental focus increased dramatically. Berserkers who had completed the full training program showed reduced responses to all forms of physical stress. They could fight with broken bones, ignore severe wounds, and maintain tactical thinking while experiencing blood loss that would send normal warriors into shock. The training also created warriors who were literally addicted to extreme conditions. Vikings who had undergone ice forging felt uncomfortable and restless when temperatures were normal. They sought out the coldest, most dangerous assignment because their nervous systems had been conditioned to produce euphoric responses to situations that terrorized other people. Each generation of berserkers needed more dangerous challenges to achieve the same psychological satisfaction their predecessors got from smaller raids. The escalation eventually led to expeditions that took Vikings as far as North America and deep into Russia, driven partly by their need for environments harsh enough to satisfy their conditioned craving for extreme survival challenges. The geographic spread of Viking influence can be traced by following the routes they took seeking colder, more challenging conditions. While other medieval armies avoided winter campaigns, Vikings specifically planned their most important raids during the harshest months of the year. They had turned the season that stopped other military forces into their greatest strategic advantage. Christian priests condemned the naked rituals as pagan devil worship and convinced Viking leaders that such practices were incompatible with their new faith. The last generation of fully trained berserkers died out around 1050 AD, taking most of their knowledge with them. Some techniques survived in modified forms among hunting and fishing but the systematic training program that created superhuman cold resistance was lost forever. Modern attempts to recreate these methods using historical records have failed, because the complete knowledge was never written down. It was passed directly from trainer to student through years of shared experience that can't be captured in words. The closest modern parallel to Viking ice forging exists in certain Tibetan Buddhist practices, where monks learn to raise their body temperature through meditation while sitting naked in mountain snow. These monks can melt snow with their body heat and survive in conditions that would kill untrained people. But even these techniques are less extreme than what Vikings achieved, because the monks use mental practices rather than the physical conditioning that changed Viking biology at the cellular. Russian military researchers spent decades during the Cold War trying to understand and recreate Viking survival methods. They subjected volunteer soldiers to progressively more extreme cold conditioning while monitoring their physiological responses. The research was abandoned after several deaths, and no successful recreation of the documented Viking capability. The conclusion was that the techniques required starting in childhood and continuing for years in ways that modern ethical standards wouldn't permit. The legacy of Viking cold survival training lives on in unexpected places. The breathing techniques developed into methods still used by freedivers who need to hold their breath underwater for extended periods. The fat and resin mixture influenced the development of modern cold weather gear and survival equipment. The psychological conditioning methods were studied by sports psychologists trying to help athletes perform under extreme pressure. But the complete system that could turn ordinary humans into warriors capable of surviving naked in frozen fjords while bleeding from fresh wounds died with the last berserkers 1,000 years ago. Modern humans have access to better technology, superior medical knowledge, and more sophisticated understanding of human physiology, but we have lost the knowledge of how to fundamentally rewire our biological responses to create superhuman survival capabilities. When Bjorn Ironside and his warriors emerged from that fjord in 867 AD, they represented the peak of human adaptation to extreme conditions achieved through pure conditioning and will. They had transcended normal human limitations, not through technology or luck, but through systematic training so brutal and precise that it remains unmatched in human history. They were living proof that humans can adapt to survive almost anything if they're willing to pay the price in suffering and risk that such adaptation demands.